All I could picture was phlegm, which quite honestly makes me want to vomit. Yeah, he cuts him up and fries him and feeds him to his customers. And the customers are like, this is the best fucking meat ever. Am I fucked in the head? Because I don't find many of these stories scary. I'm not even thinking that. I keep picturing it. He beat his mother to death with a frying pan. He's writing about sentient hairballs. How do you even have the ability and capacity to wind yourself like a snake? Not even. Like a Laffy Taffy. I would be calling the police. I would be calling the FBI. I would be calling the hospital, both for this slug child and for myself, because I now need to be hospitalized. Uzumaki is a love story, and this is my dissertation. Hello, besties. Welcome to October. And in the spirit of Halloween, I decided that I am going to read Junji Ito's works. Now, I am definitely a manga noob. While I have definitely read manga in the past, I have not read any of the major well-known mangas, and the number of mangas that I've read in comparison to the novels that I have read, it's not comparable. I recently saw Gavin from How to Train Your Gavin do a video where he read the entirety of Junji Ito's work, a 5.5 hour monster of a video that is an absolute masterpiece, and I've always been curious about Junji Ito. However, I'm not as brave as Gavin is, and I do not want to read every single Junji Ito book ever. Instead, there were a few that I was always curious about, and I decided that I wanted to read them for this video. So that is what we are doing. In this video, I am reading The Liminal Zone, Tombs, which is a short story collection, Shiver, which is a well-known short story collection. I think it's one of Junji Ito's more popular works. And of course, it wouldn't be a Junji Ito video without Uzumaki. So those are the 4 books that I am reading for this video. By its very nature, this video is going to be very spoiler filled because I am going to be talking to you about each and every one of these books in depth. I will be telling you everything that happened, whether or not it scared me, and how I feel about the stories. I won't spoil anything about how I feel by the end, but let's just say I surprised myself with some of the rankings for these books and which stories I ended up being gravitated towards. All right, besties, I have finished the first 3 story in Tombs by Junji Ito, and I'm going to try to give you the briefest summaries and my opinions of the stories. And as intro me warned you, of course, this is full of spoilers. First story is Tombs, and Tombs follows the story of this brother and sister who are going to go visit their friend, and they're driving down the road when they're involved in a hit and run accident. They hit this young girl, and they put her in the car thinking they're going to rush her to the hospital, but she dies on the way to the hospital. So now they have a dead body in the car, and instead of confessing, they panic and decide just to hide the body in the trunk of the car and proceed with their day as they plan to. However, when they're driving, they run into this street that's just full of tombstones, and when they get into this town, they realize that the entire town is full of tombstones, and it's like very difficult to drive. And their friend who they're visiting explains to them that everyone who dies in this town, including the animals, you have to keep them where they've died, because if you don't, then they won't get a tomb and their souls will never be at peace. The friends think that this means that the town won't give them a tomb, but no, when people die, their bodies turn into tombstones, and if you don't keep them in the spot that they die, it doesn't turn into a tombstone. Rather, the body kind of crystallizes and the soul is never able to find peace. The brother and sister realize that the young girl that they hit and killed on the way to visit their friend is actually their friend's sister, and they decide that the solution is to throw her into this well right here so that they can essentially get away with manslaughter of this young child. So they do that, and there are no severe consequences for them. Essentially, they're able to get away with it, except that the brother, he cuts himself on the body of the girl. That thing that I showed you is what the girl turns into, and he cuts himself on one of like the sharp edges of her. It infects him and he essentially dies and turns into the very thing. And our female character decides that she is going to turn herself in for the crime. She goes to her best friend's house to confess that they killed her little sister, but it's too late. She goes to the house and she sees 3 tombstones and realizes that the parents and her best friend have all taken their own lives out of grief for losing their child and the little sister. I didn't personally find it scary, although I found that imagery of the bodies really gross, and like how the bodies turn into tombs. I was like, ew. Loved the creativity of the idea of that. And ultimately, this was like, let's say 4 stars. I was sufficiently creeped out, but I didn't think this was necessarily scary, but it was beautifully illustrated and the story itself was very creative and very interesting. The next story is Clubhouse. And Clubhouse follows this group of 3 girls. They're completely inseparable. They're the best of friends. And one of the girls says, what I love about them is that I never feel like I have to like choose a side. Like we're all just such close friends. They go to this haunted house where one friend I think goes upstairs and the other friend goes downstairs, and this third friend or narrator isn't with them at first. For whatever reason, these 2 girls stop speaking, and this really bothers the girl that was part of their friendship group, and she says, well, what's going on? Like, why did you 2 stop being friends? And the girl that she's speaking to says, you know what, I found this new group of friends. They're really cool college kids, and you should come with me to go meet with them. Like, they have such amazing ideas and they're gonna change your entire life. So she does go up, that's backwards. So she does go up to meet them, but she finds out that they're meeting in this haunted house, which she thinks is really weird, but she's just kind of there listening to what they're talking about until one of the guys in the group calls her out, and he's like, you don't have any radical ideas. Where are your opinions? You belong to the 2nd floor, don't you? Those traitors. And then like chase her out the house. So she goes to the other friend who is part of this friendship group and say, hey, like our friend is involved in this group and I think it's really dangerous for her. My dad actually told me that this house was haunted and it was taken over by this group of radical activists a long time ago, but they split up and they ended up going to the 1st floor and 2nd floor, but they used to be friends, and it caused like this big war and they all shot each other and most of them died. That house that they were in, they were never able to tear down. So she tells her friend all of this and says, we have to go rescue our other friend because she's being possessed by ghosts. So her friend says, don't worry, I know what to do. I have this psychic friend and she's going to be able to help us out. I know where she lives. It's a little bit secluded, but come on, let's go. So she takes her and she's like, this house is really old and like abandoned. And then her friend turns to her and says, you're so silly. We went through the back entrance, so you must not have recognized it, but this is the haunted house. And oh my gosh, it's this group of radicals, this 2nd floor radicals, where she feels kind of torn between these 2 groups because she has no option to escape. So she like breaks the door down. She's running down the stairs to the 1st floor, but she trips and falls and her head is stuck through the door, and each side is kind of pulling on her to get them to be on her side. I did not think this was scary at all. Not even a little bit. Like, no part of this scared me. I think it might have been a statement about being torn between friendships and perhaps like losing identity and trying to find yourself in others. Maybe, but I don't know. I think this was scary. If anything, I laughed multiple times throughout this because it was quite silly. The ghosts themselves really looked just like people, and I wanted more scare factor, and the illustrations themselves at no point are super creepy, so I'm gonna have to give this a 2-star overall. And so we come to the 3rd story that I have finished, and that is Slug Girl. Slug Girl is a very short story within this collection of tombs, and I keep holding this backwards. In Slug Girl, we're following a girl who was very, very talkative throughout all of her school years. And her best friend notices that she kind of just stopped speaking and isn't really talking to a lot of people. She's refusing to say things, and it's almost like she's choking on something. Like, it's hard for her to speak until she eventually stops showing up to school. So our main character, our narrator, decides that she's gonna go and check in on her friend because something is wrong. So she goes and checks in on her, and she sees that her friend's parents are still in the backyard fighting these slugs because they've had this massive slug infestation for a long time, which is awful because she knows that her best friend is terrified terrified of slugs, and she recalls that she's only ever seen her friend afraid once, and it was when they were kids and a bunch of kids from school came over to her house and they saw the slugs and one of them scared her with it, and that's kind of when everything started. So she sees her friend is upstairs, she's wearing a mask, and she's like, oh, she must be sick, but the mom's like, I don't think so, I think something's in her mouth, but she's not letting anyone see. She eventually comes back to check in on her friend, and she sees that her friend is not doing so hot, and she in fact has a sentient slug which she has no control over, which has taken over her entire mouth. The imagery for this is quite disgusting because slugs are super slimy, and the way it just like crawls over her face and is in her mouth, I was like, ugh, ew, ew. All I could picture was phlegm, which quite honestly makes me want to vomit. Like, nasty. The body horror, disgusting. Ew. That to me was the most disturbing part. And much like Tombs, I found this deeply creative because I was like, who thinks of this? That is so bizarre, but also, ew. Could you imagine, I can't even, having a live slug crawling around your mouth and all over your face? Ew, ew. Anyway, her parents are freaked out, and regardless of how many times like she cuts her own tongue off, it just keeps regrowing slugs, until one day her parents are desperate and they like just buy a shit ton of salt, fill their bathtub with it, and says, no, like, listen, you get into the bathtub and then the slug is going to shrivel up and die. Just put your head under and open your mouth. And that's what she does, and she's in there for a long time. The parents think, oh my gosh, did she pass out? Is she drowning in a bath of salt? It's just salt, there's no water. They pull her out of the tub, and what they see is just her head. It's just her head that is in there. Her body has disappeared, her clothes are in there. They're like, what the fuck happened? And they see that there is a tiny slug just connected to her neck, and she ends up turning into a slug, and the shell of the slug is her head. It's quite a disturbing visual because you would assume then by the look and the expression on the shell's face that our character who was affected by this is very much alive and sentient and aware and is doomed to be the shell of a slug for the rest of her life, which just vile, absolutely vile. Very creative, very bizarre. The imagery itself is nausea-inducing, and I think I enjoyed this. I'm gonna settle at 3.5 stars for this one, and I'm gonna continue with the story in between my meetings and hopefully get to the end of this book. The stories are moving pretty quickly. I think there's a series of short stories, and I'm very excited to continue with it. So far, so good. I've made it through the next 3 stories of Tombs as the sun sets here. I know the audio isn't great, my apologies, but the first story was The Window Next Door in this little subsection of stories. In The Window Next Door, we're following a family who has moved into this really small house. I think it's like 2 bedrooms total, and their son lives in the upstairs bedroom. There's this house that's right next to their house. It's really weird because it only has 1 window, and everyone's like, yeah, I don't know who lives here. Some woman, she doesn't really come out of her house. No one knows what she looks like. We've never seen her. Just like, stay away from there. Our teenage boy, he's like, yeah, whatever. And he's just sleeping in his bedroom when all of a sudden he hears, young man, are you awake, young man? Which is really fucking creepy. Ew. And he looks out of his window, and this is what's staring at him. Ew. Something that I've learned in reading this is that Junji Ito really plays with, I always forget the name of it, like triple something foam, the thing where you're scared of holes, like clusters of holes, which I definitely had to an extent. So I looked at this and I was like, ew, yuck. Anyway, so she's super fucking creepy, definitely giving strong predator vibes, and she keeps whispering to him in the night, and it's like, hey, listen, I'm gonna come over, just like grab this pole and I'll come through your window, I'll leave the front door unlocked, you can come get some tea. And he's like,
it's not going to happen.
Woman, no, the fuck, absolutely not. So he tells his parents, and he's like, I'm not sleeping in that room, you can sleep in that room. So they switch rooms, but while the parents are up there, they don't see anyone, and they're just like, yeah, no, I think that you should be fine now. So he goes back to his room, and sure enough, it starts again, and the woman's like, I can almost touch your window, just like when I knock on the window, open the door. And he's like, ew, creeper. Realizes that the woman was crawling closer to him because the house, there's a scene where she's like reaching for him through the window, and it looks like this. It was fine. Creativity, high. Creep factor, I guess. Mostly it was just okay, and I'm gonna give that 2.5 stars for my overall enjoyment level for the story. I was not spooked. I was mostly just grossed out. The next story was Washed Ashore, which is a little bit more like ocean horror. So this creature washes up onto the beach. No one's ever seen anything like it, and as you can see, playing with the whole fear of cluster holes like thing going on there. So it's that massive creature, and lots of people who are scared of the ocean end up being drawn to it. And there's a bunch of scientists just trying to figure out exactly what this creature is. And they look through its skin where it's transparent, and they realize that there are people stuck inside this creature's stomach. And they're like, quick, we gotta cut this thing open. How did it eat so many people? This is like a giant man-eating monster. So they cut the thing open, and literally a sea of bodies pour out of it, just like a sea. And they realize that the people are moving, so they think, oh my gosh, these people are alive. Quick, we have to help them. Someone call the hospital. But obviously, they're not fucking alive. Like, hello, you've been living inside of the stomach of a sea creature for 7 years, because they realize that all of these people were the people who like died or disappeared in this terrible ferry accident 7 years ago. And that's it. And they realize these people weren't alive, and they were surviving off of the like whatever was inside of the stomach, like parasites. And like, oh my gosh, can humans be parasites? I don't have a fear of sea monsters or sea creatures. Do I have a fear of deep water? Yes, but this doesn't take place in deep water, so I didn't personally find this scary. If anything, I was like, you're trying to scare me with these pictures. And to be fair, this, whatever's in his mouth, bleh, ew, that was gross. But like the previous story, I would give this maybe a slightly higher at 2.75 stars. It was entertaining for what it was, but it was fine. So 2.75 stars. Which brings me to the final story that I read for this little section, which is The Strange Tale of the Tunnel. The Strange Tale of the Tunnel. You're following this boy, and his first memory is going to this tunnel with his mom, where he is just like there with her, and she walks into the tunnel, and suddenly a train comes barreling out, and they're like, oh my gosh, did we hit someone? Obviously his mom does not survive that, and they say that it's a suicide. So he gets told by his aunt that he's the older brother, and he has to be strong for his little sister and take care of his little sister. One day his friends tell him that they're going to go to the tunnel, and that he's scared of them and he needs to come with them, otherwise he's scared. And some of the friends try to stand up for him and say, like, you know, his mom actually died in that tunnel, and I don't think that's right. But Mr. Ringleader guy's like, I don't give a fuck. So they go to the tunnel, they're walking through, and they're thinking it's super creepy. They run into this girl, they think it's a ghost. It's not a ghost. Our main character realizes that's his little sister, and for some reason she's being drawn to the tunnel, so he pulls her out. But each and every day she keeps going back to the tunnel, and she's terrified because she doesn't know why she's doing that, until eventually she stumbles upon a secret lab in the tunnel where they're studying radiation. Why they're doing that in a tunnel, I don't fucking know. But the whole point of the story and how this ends is that they are getting sucked into the tunnel. Like, the ground is absorbing them, even though the ground is solid stone, and there are ghosts and spirits who are trapped, because if you get sucked into the tunnel, you're stuck there forever. And there's this scene where he is there at the very end. You just see all of the trapped souls zoom in around the tunnel. I enjoyed this. I actually thought the setup of the story was really good, and there was a lot of intrigue and character development going on. And while I was not personally terrified of the scene with the tunnels, there are some moments that definitely can trigger that feeling. Like, you can see when they like actually get absorbed into the ground, and like you can see our character taking his final breaths, and that itself is super creepy, as well as that image that I shared with you with the final scene of all of the spirits zooming around the tunnel. I think that I'm gonna settle at like 4 stars for this specific story. I think it's been my favorite story in the collection so far, but I'm going to finish the last, I think there are like 4 or 5 stories, so I'm actually gonna finish the rest of this book, and then I'll see you probably in the morning with my final updates for Tombs, just because I don't like filming at night. And as you can see, I'm getting very yellow lighting because I'm getting my final few minutes of sunlight before the sun sets. So I'll see you in the morning with my final updates for Tombs. Okay, it's the next day and I have officially finished Tombs by Junji Ito. So let me tell you about the final 3 or 4 stories that I read in this book. Bronze Statue. Bronze Statue is the story of this woman who like has a statue made of herself, and people make fun of her behind her back all the time because they're like, ha ha ha, this statue is young and beautiful and she's an old fucking hag. That's not her. She's delusional. She has this statue in the park that her husband owned, and her husband died under mysterious circumstances like 3 years ago. And a group of women get invited to this dinner party that she's hosting, and she's like, thank you so much for coming to my park and to supporting the park. This is just a celebration of you all, and I want to unveil my new statue. Here it is. Let me introduce you to the creator of the statue, who's like so talented. The creator, the artist for the statue is like, oh, I'm like getting old and tired. I'm gonna go to bed. So they leave the room, and as soon as they leave the room, the women who were invited to the party start gossiping and making fun of the lady, the mayor's wife. And when I read that, I felt bad for her because I was like, there's like, what, she aged and her body changed and that's what you're making fun of her for? They're saying that statue can't be her, even though she's never said that it is her now. It's just her as she used to be when she was younger. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, y'all are rude as fuck, because here she is inviting you to this really nice dinner party with this really fantastic food, just celebrating and thanking you all for using the park that her husband built for her and loved so much. And I was like, y'all suck. Until I realized it was always a trap. See, the statue in the park is equipped with a camera and with a tiny microphone where she is able to hear everything that people talk about in the park. So she specifically invited this group of women because they always make fun of her. And the food that was so nice at the dinner party was actually drugged. So they wake up tied in the artist's basement, and they're all murdered by having hot metal thrown on them, I think, or like wax, and then they're encased in concrete and thrown into the thing that he uses to fire the metal. So let me show you the scene because ew. Like, here's the scene where they're getting that hot ass shit poured all over them, screaming to death. And then they get fired, and that's what their statues look like by the end. You can see all the boils where their skin was boiling and popping. A little silly, a little ridiculous, because this ends with the male statue, her husband's statue, who's at the park, speaking in her husband's dead voice, and she's like, what the fuck? My statue spoke because I was speaking through it, but who the hell is talking there? So she pulls up her husband's dead body where she buried him in the swamp 3 years ago, and he's just talking to her. He's like, you ain't shit. You're a murderer, you're a serial killer. And instead of like, she wants to burn the body, but instead of doing that, the sculptor guy is like, let me turn him into an Adonis. And so they sculpt his body because of the way it was like decomposing in the swamp. It turned it into like wax almost, and he just carved him into the statue and cast him in bronze. Both of the statues became sentient and fell in love with each other. And our main character, the mayor's wife, the old hag, as the town called her, decides that she's gonna take her own life and also throw herself into the swamp so that she too can be immortalized as a beautiful statue. But when it's time for her to be turned into the statue and like finalized, the artist dies before he's able to finish her. And so she's stuck in her casing for all of eternity. And that's the story. It was silly. I think it was scary. No. Did I laugh? Yeah. And if anything, this reading experience has taught me, am I fucked in the head? Because I don't find many of these stories scary. If anything, I'm just like amused and think, wow, that's so creative. And I'm giving this story overall a rating of 3 stars. Floaters was the next story. And my goodness, Floaters. Let me tell you something about this. This one I personally found the most disturbing. And the reason that is when I was very, very young, my cousins forced me to watch The Ring. I was way too young to be watching it, but subconsciously I remembered this scene where the Ew, just think about it. She's on the floor and she's pulling. I'm not even faking that. I keep picturing it. And then my mouth is filling with saliva like I want to vomit. She's pulling the hair out of her throat, okay? Ew, ew! And subconsciously, ever since then, hair not attached to people's body grosses me the fuck out. Like, literally, I could vomit. So this story of floaters very obviously gave me a fucking ick because of ew. So floaters is a very bizarre story of where people's thoughts essentially like manifest in physical form as little floating hairballs that just repeat their like innermost thoughts in their voice. We initially follow this boy who's the first one affected, and all of his little floaters get out and people realize all of his innermost thoughts, including thoughts that he doesn't want people to know. And he's like bullied for it, and he ends up taking his own life. And after that, the whole floater situation becomes bigger because now everyone has floaters and they're spilling into the entire like atmosphere. And there's this young boy who is honestly hella fucking gross. He gets obsessed with these floaters. He wants to hoard everyone's secrets. So he goes around capturing these floating hairballs to know the secrets of everyone. And he doesn't care how he's going to get it. He has outright murdered people for the rights to a certain floater. Look at him. Absolutely demented. So he's doing all that. He's a little shit. His mom eventually like throws all of the floaters out because she's like, this is too loud. I don't like this shit. Like, I couldn't sleep. And he's like, the fuck do you mean? Like, literally loses his shit and beats his mother to death with a frying pan. Am I kidding? No. He beats his mother to death with a frying pan, and the rage that flew through my body, I was like, kid, I don't fucking think so. Let you try it. Let you try it, because I will be in jail faster than you can fucking blink. He beat his mother to death with a frying pan. Anyway, little shit gets his own floaters. Everyone's disappears, but his doesn't. His go flying around everywhere, essentially confessing to all the people that he has murdered in his attempt to get everyone's secrets via these floating hairballs. His turn into a tree. He thinks he's getting away with it, but it just starts shouting what he's done to the entire world. We don't know what happens after that, but we know that two of the characters that we initially met at the beginning of the story go to the tree. It's the tree of the hairball from the first boy who initially was the one to start the whole floater thing, who took his own life. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I do love you. I thought that was weird because here's the relationship. We have boy one, boy two, and girlfriend of boy two. Boy one is case number one for the floaters. And he is devastated because his thoughts are going out. And one of his thoughts is that he's in love with his best friend's girlfriend. Turns out she also had feelings for him, but he died. So boy two, this girl's boyfriend, takes her to the tree so she can hear his final thoughts, which is, I'm sorry I lied to you. I did have feelings for you. And I was like, aren't you upset? I mean, you're upset for a variety of reasons, but also your best friend and your girlfriend secretly had feelings for each other the whole time you were all together. Anyway, creativity, a 10. Like, so creative, so fucking bizarre, as most of the stories are in here, which I'm loving the uniqueness of every single one of these. Did this scare me? No. Did it mildly ick me out because of my whole hair thing? Mildly, but really I have to think about long strands. I'm not even gonna go there. Yeah, so there you go. I'm gonna give this one ultimately a 2.5 stars. And so we have our final story, the bloody story of Shirosuna. In this story, we are following a doctor who is really passionate about helping people who need access to medical care. So he chooses to work in a very remote village. And when he's working in this village as a doctor, he realizes that a lot of people look really sick, emaciated, very pale. He's wondering what is going on and why the people here are so sick. And when he's there, he also realizes that people just kind of spontaneously bleed. This hair is just gonna stay where she is. They just spontaneously like start bleeding. They don't have any injuries. They literally just start pouring blood out of their skin. And he's like, that's fucking weird. So one day he is going for a walk in the middle of the night in the forest, as one does. and he runs into the older sister of this little girl he was treating earlier in the week. And she's like, oh, I'm just going up to the shrine to pray. You know, a long time ago at the shrine, they sacrificed a bunch of maidens and their blood poured into the earth. And then she just like slits her wrist and starts bleeding out. Like literally he describes it as an ocean of blood just like gushing out of her. And he's like, oh my gosh, you're gonna bleed out. Like what the he's freaking out. He's trying to help her, but she just gets up and walks away as she's like bleeding. And she's like, nah, this just happened. And no one seems to think that that is weird. So he freaks out because he realizes that the blood that was pouring out of her is literally being absorbed into the earth, and not like it's sinking into the ground. Like the earth is drinking the blood. So he digs a hole and he realizes that running through the entire town are veins and arteries, and they're not tree roots because they're like pulsing and you can see the blood running through the veins. And he realizes that the earth underneath the shrine in this village is just like absorbing people's blood. He tries to convince everyone of this by showing everyone like, here are the veins, and they're like, it's water, a water pipe. And he's like, you don't have plumbing. He's like, it's a gas pipe. And they're like, no, it's blood. And he stabs it and just like whoosh, a geyser of blood comes pouring out, and everyone drops to the ground and starts bleeding to death, throwing up vomit, throwing up blood. I didn't mean for this to happen. The earth is taking all the blood back from all of the villagers. I have to suture the wound. As you can tell by my tone of voice, also ridiculous, but the creativity, a 10 out of 10. As I was reading this, I was like, am I actually losing it? Because I did not find any of these stories scary. If anything, I viewed this as comedic horror and quite literally was deeply amused for almost the entirety of the story. I will say to an extent that has to be the intention because some of these stories are so ridiculous. Of course, Junji Ito has to know there's gonna be some element of comedy. Like, come on, he's writing about sentient hairballs. Some of these stories he has to know is comedic, and I really enjoyed my overall experience reading Tombs. Here is my final rating for all of the stories, as well as my overall rating for Tombs itself. As I mentioned, I had a lot of fun with it. I did not personally find this scary, but I did find it deeply amusing. So the next book that I will be reading is another short story collection by Junji Ito, and that is Shiver. Welcome to nighttime, where I am reading Shiver and am about halfway through. So I read the first 4 stories and Shiver, and what's different about this volume that I find so interesting is at the end of every short story, Junji Ito comes in and tells you more about the inspiration for that story and gives you a little bit more context, which I personally find really, really interesting. So I read the first 4 stories as I mentioned. I'm going to tell you about each of them. We start off with Used Record, and Used Record reminds me of a story that I read earlier, which was so much fun. It's the story of these 2 girls, and one of the girl has this record, and the record is just like beautiful and haunting, and when they listen to it, they're completely obsessed. So the friend who went to visit her friend, the one who showed her the record, she's like, hey, can I borrow this? I can record it. This is such a cool song, and I would love to have a copy for myself. And her friend goes, no, you can't have it. I'm not gonna tell you where it's from. It's not for you. If you tape it or you record it, you're gonna take away some of its essence. So they get into a fight, and the girl steals it, and the other girl chases her down, and our main character in the story proceeds to kill her best friend. Yikes, bestie. She doesn't think that her friend is dead because after her friend dies, she hears her friend singing, so she's just like, whatever, you're being weird. So she goes to a bunch of shops to try to find someone who's gonna play this record, and of course it's very haunting, and she comes to find out that this record was actually recorded by a famous artist who finally got their big break and was going to record their debut album, but unfortunately that day on her way to the studio, she gets hit by a car, and her dying request is that they bring her up to the studio so that she can record, but they all know she's in no condition to do that, but she insists, and they feel bad for her. They're moved by her passion for the song, and they place her in front of the microphone, and as soon as she goes, she dies. Literally does not get to record. We're all surprised because they hear singing. She starts singing even though she's very much dead. The song that they get is the one that was recorded after this woman dies, which is why it has such haunting properties and why people are so obsessed with it. So that's the story. I did enjoy this one overall, although I didn't personally find it very terrifying. Just a little bit sad and melancholy, which I think was the intention. And I would say I'd probably give this like 2.5 stars. Story in this is Shiver, the namesake of this book. So in Shiver, we are following this young boy who has this neighbor, and his neighbor is like apparently really sick. She's always been sick. He hears her screaming all the time, but because she's afraid of doctors, and then she'll sometimes pop her head out the window and point to something and then like laugh maniacally. And our main character thinks that's really fucking weird, but he sees that her arm is like riddled with holes, and he recalls that his grandfather, when he passed away, was also riddled with holes. Long story short, he and his friend find a diary of his grandpa and realize this is a curse for this jade bug that they found during the war, and whoever is in possession of the jade bug gets severely infested, and this doctor is not really a doctor but rather a manifestation of the curse, here to make it worse. Our main character's friend finds the jade bug and he gets cursed and possessed, although it does free the young girl of her curse, and he winds up dead in a river. This was such an interesting story, and I love the idea. There's this line in here that's like, I'm so cold and I'm shivering because the wind is getting through the holes in my body. And it's like, that's chilling. And also there's like bugs that crawl into the hole, and I was like, ew, the absolute ick, the absolute ick. So I enjoyed this, I think, more than I enjoyed the first story. There was definitely some creep factors in this, but I would again say that my overall feelings are maybe like 3.5 stars for this. And at this point I learned, because Junji Ito tells us, that all of the stories in here, aside from the first one, are actually from magazines, short stories that he's written for a magazine, all compiled into one collection. Then we have Fashion Model, and Fashion Model was a fun one. So in Fashion Model, we're following this very artistic kid. He's like a writer, a screenwriter, directing movies and stuff, and he's always gotten like these ominous bad feelings, and whenever he gets an ominous bad feeling, something bad happens. So for example, as a child, he had a bad feeling and he ended up getting hit by a car, but this bad feeling is like worse than anything he has ever experienced. And he's in the store and he's looking just through a magazine for inspiration, trying to calm down, and he sees this and he's like, what the fuck? Why is she in a fashion magazine? Like, the hell is this? And it literally haunts him. He does not see this woman again, but each and every time in his dreams and memories, her face changes and becomes worse and worse and worse. And he tells his friend, like, this is really making me scared. And he's like, oh, you just need exposure therapy. Like, go look at the woman again. I'm sure you'll realize she's not that scary. But they're filming a movie and they end up putting out a casting call. And one of the invitations that they get, or one of the applications that they get, excuse me, is from a woman. So his friend is a fucking idiot and chooses to hire her because he thinks that hiring her will help his friend out, and she has a really like commanding and scary presence that they think would be great for their horror movie. So lo and behold, she shows up. Miss Girl is tall as fuck, taller than any human could possibly be, but they ignore that, you know, and they go into the forest and they're filming, and his friend says an offhand comment to the woman. He's like, oh my gosh, you're a model. This here is your biggest fan, about his friend, the screenwriter, who is terrified of this woman, and she really likes that. But they quickly realize, Miss Ma'am, she ain't human. Not human. So they're filming and they're giving all the attention to the pretty girl that they hire to be the protagonist, and this upsets our supermodel character. She proceeds to eat her. And they quickly realize, oh shit, that's not a human. They get away, but one of their friends unfortunately does get eaten, and that is pretty much how the story ends. Like, look at this. I loved this story. This was so much fun. Like, she straight up freaking just eating people, just eating people. That is what's going on. I thought this was genuinely scary, and I love the idea of like a movie being filmed and one of the cast members not being a human and like everyone getting eaten in the forest. This is exactly my kind of horror story, so I would give this like a 4.5 stars. I really enjoyed this, and I was watching Gavin's video where he reads like the entirety of all of Junji Ito's work, which is not what I'm doing in this video, but I'll leave Gavin's video linked below in case you want to check it out. This was super fun, but I know from Gavin's video that Miss Model might show up a little bit later on as well. That brings us to the 4th story in this, and that is Hanging Blimp. Hanging Blimp is a great example of Junji Ito's creativity, because I was like, who comes up with this? Like, genuinely, who comes up with this? I'm amused, but know that there are some darker themes throughout this story, and there are definitely moments that are not amusing at all. So you need content warnings for this. Our story opens up with this mega famous musician, like pop star, who is found hung outside of her building. And she is hung pretty viciously. She is hung by a telephone cord, and her cord went through her neck so severely that her head is pretty much almost hanging off. That is how the story opens. And we speak about how that has impacted all of her friends, because our main female character in this story is the best friend of that pop star. They went to school together. All of the deceased person's like fans, like she had a massive fan gathering. They are all terribly upset by the death of this person, and soon enough ghost stories start to appear. And it's not the kind of ghost story you would think. They are seeing the deceased character's floating head, severed at the neck, everywhere. And people think that it's mass hysteria until there's proof. It is in fact her floating head everywhere. And from there, the story quickly devolves into chaos, because everyone has floating heads, and these floating heads are completely sentient. And what they do is, when they recognize someone who has their face, because every single floating head has a real life person, it comes after them and it attacks them. And they all have like swinging ropes coming from their neck, so it chases the person, loops it around their head, and essentially hangs them and kills them. And this is not a phenomenon limited to this small town. It's sweeps the entire country. Now, they are urging everyone, as soon as this happens, to not go outside because it's dangerous. They're being targeted. They really should stay inside if they can. And the father immediately says, wow, well, I gotta go to work now. And the kids are understandably like, what the fuck are you talking about? You have to go to work now. And the dad's like, no, don't worry about it. I'll be fine. Spoiler alert, because this whole video is spoilers, so really unnecessary to alert you. But he's not okay. He takes about 2 steps outside, and he is swung up right by his throat. Farewell to the father. And then 2 seconds after witnessing his father die, the brother is like, well, I'm gonna go find us food because we can't stay in this house. It's been 2 seconds since he witnessed his father die. And he's like, I'm gonna go find us food. And the mom and sister are like, no, you can't do that. Like, obviously your dad has just passed away. It's too dangerous. I'm up there like crying and upset. And you know what he does? Do you know what it is that he does? Punches his sister in the face and tells her to shut up. At which point I was like, well, fuck you, dude. Your balloon gonna come and get your ass. And sure enough, the balloon does eventually come and get his ass. And our main female character is eventually left alone because her mother gets like frightened and terrified and decides that she wants it to be over. So she goes outside. This was such a creative story, and I really enjoyed like the connection I felt to our main female character. I thought that she was really well developed, and the illustrations in here are beautiful as always. But the concept of this is a really interesting combination of dark and scary and sad, but also humorous, because it's floating head blimps floating around like balloons, but the balloon's anchor is, trigger warning please, people hanging from their necks. Yep, that's it. That's the story. I really enjoyed this one as well, and I would say that I would give this one overall maybe like a 3.75 or 4-star rating. I think I'll settle for 4 stars just because of how creative it is and how well it balances that humor with that darkness. It's time for me to continue. I have a few more stories left in Shiver, so I'm gonna get through the next 3 or so stories and I will give you my updates and feelings for each of them, and then we'll finish the book. Tried a new brow product and I don't like it, so pretend you don't see it. Now that my voice is clear from the sickness I'm recovering from, I have finished Shiver by Junji Ito. I finished the final stories in this book, and I'm going to tell you, this book genuinely scared me, and I'm going to tell you why. But first, let me go through and give you my ratings. And I've realized that throughout this video, I've been giving you a lot of summary of what happened because obviously it's a spoiler-filled vlog and the summary is part of the fun. But I'm going to try to focus more on review. I think that you can tell a lot about how I feel about that story via my tone and my body language, but let's go through the remaining story. After finishing Hanging Blimp, I finished Marionette Mansion, and Marionette Mansion is the story of this family who are like very poor and they're puppeteers, and it's a single dad and his kids, and he refuses to stop puppeteering even though their family is very much struggling. He like has this obsession with the puppets, and eventually they start to feel like the puppets are actually controlling them and not the other way around. The father dies, that's backwards. The father dies because of an illness, and the oldest son runs away, and the youngest boy and his little sister end up getting taken by their family to the point where the youngest boy is able to take care of himself and his sister on their own. They move to this town and they run into their older brother, who is now also obsessed with puppets, but takes it a bit too far. He's very wealthy, he's the CEO of this company, but he hasn't left his home in several years because, you can see that, they're all controlled by strings and their servants. They've literally hooked themselves up to strings like puppets, and they are so wealthy that they have servants who live in the attic who control them. And he's like, no, I really like it. It's actually like super relaxing. I don't have to do anything. I can literally just sit here, and it's all thanks to Jean-Pierre. Who is Jean-Pierre, you may ask? It's this, hopefully you can see him, absolute nightmare right fucking here. I found this story creepy because I personally am afraid of like dolls and puppets, like Slappy and that thing from Dead Silence. Yeah, totally not into that. So the concept of puppets and like a sentient puppet controlling the humans was very bizarre and unsettling. And of course, it does not end well. Our main character is a younger brother. His girlfriend thinks that he's cheating on her because from the window, she sees this, but really it's like life-size puppets that he's talking to because apparently they're sentient and the ballerinas are obsessed with him. So he's like, what the fuck do you want? So his girlfriend storms into the house, and unfortunately she runs into Jean-Pierre, and Jean-Pierre absolutely massacres her, strings her up like a puppet, and takes control of the entire family. But our youngest brother is able to rescue everyone. And while this was definitely silly at times, I think I overall enjoyed it. And I'm seeing this theme with Junji Ito, which I'm really enjoying, and that's this balance of like comedy and like absurd concepts with actual horror in there. Like, it was an unsettling story, but it wasn't a scary story necessarily, despite my fear of puppets. I would give this one a 4-star rating overall. But I'm going to tell you on a more serious note, I mentioned before that Junji Ito has his little author commentary after each and every story in this book. And this author commentary was a little bit sad. It's like speaking a lot to his feelings of being overworked and how he feels like he would get so much more done if he was just strung up in the ceiling and someone was controlling his movements for him. So I was like, oh, that's sad. But I'm enjoying the commentary of Junji Ito throughout this because I feel like I'm getting more of a sense of him and his work and who he is, his personality throughout this, which is really interesting to see beyond just the kind of stories that he tells and his personal art style. The next story in here is Painter, and I was so surprised by this one because in this one we open up with an artist showing his masterpiece. and he's saying that after he painted this, his entire career was ruined. And this all started when he met a young woman at one of his biggest gallery opens named Tomi. I loved seeing that because if you don't know, Tomi is one of Junji Ito's like better known works, and he mentions in his author commentary that it all started with like this story, and it eventually, I think years down the road, turned into something else. So Tomi is the story of this artist and this woman named Tomi. And Tomi is, quite honestly, very fucking full of herself. She thinks she is the most beautiful thing to walk this earth, and she wants someone to capture her beauty and immortalize it. And the artist says like, well, why don't you just get a photo? And she's like, no. Photos and cameras can't capture my beauty. It needs to be captured in art. So she gets into the artist's head and says, your model is such a dimwit and you don't have the ability to capture my beauty. So he eventually agrees to paint Tomi, and she is very upset because she's like, nope, you can't do it either. So she goes to another artist who sculpts. And our main artist character realizes that this other artist might have been sabotaging him. So he goes in and he's like, what the fuck is she in? Like slams his head on the floor because he thinks that he sent Tomi after him, and that's why his career is failing. But Tomi is stuck in here and she's absolutely terrified. She says that the artist, the sculptor artist, smashed all of the statues of her and was trying to kill her and cut her up into pieces. So our painter takes her back to the studio and she sits for a painting again. And the painting that he draws is this one that you saw in the beginning. And he's like, finally, I've captured your beauty. And she's like, how dare you paint me as a monster? Like, this must be a joke. You're a talentless hack. And he strangles Tomi to death and then cuts her up into little pieces. Yeah. And then he sits in his studio with her cut up pieces as they rot. But not only do they rot, she eventually starts to grow more of her from her limbs. So if you can see, there's Tomi regenerating from her cut off arm. And there's Tomi regenerating from her cut up leg. And he's just sitting there waiting. The butchering scene, as you can see, is quite brutal. I really enjoyed this story, and of all of them, I think this got into my head the most because I genuinely started having nightmares about this, with Tomi crawling out the TV as if she was the girl from The Grudge. Wow, that just scared me. It sprints. I'll be right back. Anyway, I actually felt bad for Tomi because she genuinely is scared when these people are trying to kill her, and when they cut her into pieces, she says like everyone always tries to do that to her, and I feel bad that she's like essentially stuck in this eternal loop where she's doomed to be murdered, and she's doomed to be murdered all the time. Like, here's the scene where the first sculptor artist tries to kill her, and she genuinely is terrified. So I feel bad for Tomi, even though she may be a walking, talking demon. I don't know. I don't know the full story of Tomi, but I did enjoy this story, kind of like the artist's descent into madness, this violent and horrific act that he commits in the end. I like the role that Tomi plays in this. Like, she very much is, obviously it's a paranormal story, so Tomi genuinely is cursing the people around her, and I just really enjoyed the story. And as I mentioned, had dreams about Tomi, and I just feel bad for her, and I would say I would also give this one 4 stars. Then we have The Long Dream, and The Long Dream takes place in what I believe to be a psychiatric ward with this girl who is absolutely terrified of death. Like, it paralyzes her entire like life and being. Like, she is terrified, and there is a patient who comes in and he is saying that he's having these dreams that are very long. Like, each time he dreams, he's stuck in that dream for what feels like a year, and each and every time it gets longer. So it's a year, 10 years, 100 years, thousands of years. However, it's not just happening in his mind. His body is quite literally deteriorating throughout this, and the whole concept of this is him being stuck in these hellish escapes in his mind, and how each and every time he falls asleep and dreams, when he wakes up, he has difficulty remembering reality, up onto the point where he turns into this thing And he believes that young girl in the ward who is scared of death is actually his wife, because they got married in a dream and they've been married for thousands of years, and he's having difficulty remembering reality. And I would say the most scary part of this story for me is this here. Because ew, again, I think I mentioned this, that Junji Ito is playing with that fear people have of like clustered holes, which I have, but I can never pronounce that phobia. So this, bleh, vomit inducing, absolutely disgusting. But as it turns out, all of this is caused for this man because of these little crystals that they find inside of him when he shatters. And our doctor goes off the fucking rails and feeds it to this young girl who's afraid of death. And he's like, well, you know what? This is a great experiment for us. And if she's afraid of death, well, then she can just go to sleep and dream for eternity. And there you go. Her life is now long and she no longer has to fear death. And that's how the story ends. I feel like the story has the potential to be really, really creepy, especially playing with the whole concept of dream. Did the Insidious movies play with that concept of dreams? I think they did, but there's a lot that could have been done. But I'm going to say it's a short story. So like that kind of is what it is. But I would say I'd give this one 2.75. And so far, I think it's my least favorite in this collection. And then we have Honored Ancestors, and this one is yet again about a creepy man. So we are following this young woman who sees something so frightening that she is absolutely like mentally petrified, and she cannot speak, she can't do anything. She eventually completely loses her memory, and her friend, this dude, comes to see her, and he's like, well, you get to experience everything all over again. Like, it sucks that you lost your memory, but here we go. Like, we were actually talking, we were having a conversation. I realized that I loved you and you promised to marry me and like come to my house and we'll hang out. You get to meet my dad, and his dad is fallen to some kind of condition where he can no longer move, and this is kind of how he gets around the house. So she meets his father, and she's just trying to gather her memories. And long story short, his family has this thing where all of the ancestors, when they die, the top of their heads come off, and it keeps their brains and their thoughts, and it attaches itself to the next descendant. So the father actually looks like this, and our main character psychologically like remembered this as a giant caterpillar, but it wasn't. It was just the skulls and caps of every ancestor in this family attached to the father, and he is dying, so the skulls are going to attach themselves to his son. But before that happens, the son needs to have an heir, and he realizes that's going to be really difficult having a chain of thousands of years of skulls attached to his head. So he traps Risa, our main character, in the house and says, you're going to have my baby and be my wife. And she's like, I don't fucking think so, and tries to leave, but unfortunately she is once again terrified and remembers nothing. That was truly horrifying. The idea of a woman being stuck inside of a house where someone is forcing her to be his wife and to have his children. And not only that, but he also has the decapitated like craniums of thousands of years of people attached to his head. That was a bizarre concept, but I thought it was interesting because there's this underlying conversation that could be had here about generational trauma. I kind of felt like the idea that the descendants of this family are always plagued by the thoughts and feelings and memories of the generations prior to them. I thought that was a really interesting conversation about generational trauma. And I would give that story maybe also like a 2.75 stars, something around there. And then we have Greased Oil, which technically is the last story, but there's a bonus story in here. And Greased Oil is the story of, again, a single father and his two children who live in this apartment above a restaurant that their family owns. However, this restaurant is super greasy. They sell like fried meats, and the oils, it's not very well ventilated, so like the oils leak up into the house, and everything is so greasy and covered in grease. And I love how Junji Ito depicts this, because this genuinely just gives you a slimy feeling. Like, it's genuinely so disturbing and gross. And our main female character, her brother, he tortures her, he's a bully, and he chugs olive oil. It's his favorite drink ever. He just chugs oil constantly. But eventually he hits puberty and he starts breaking out, and that gets him bullied quite a bit by people at his school, and he's miserable and he takes it out on his family, culminating in this scene where he is trying to beat his sister. His father interrupts and his father also gets hit. And I'll tell you, one of the creepiest scenes in here is so fucking gross to me. Number one, the concept of how this child drinks oil is disgusting. But number two, Junji Ito starts playing with body horror here. And because he's breaking out so badly, because obviously he's chugging fucking oil and living in an oil slick, he gets a lot of breaks out and he does this. Again, that small hole thing, ew. But he does this and he's dripping his like pus from his zits onto his sister and is like trying to strangle her and drown her, and like this whole scene, absolutely disgusting, vile. Made me want to fucking throw up. And he's choking her and he's talking about, I don't care if I go to hell, let them burn my oil and have my smoke. Like, ridiculous villain monologue, until his dad comes home, smacks him in the back of the head with a frying pan and kills him. Do you know how he disposes the body? Yeah, he cuts him up and fries him and feeds him to his customers. And the customers are like, this is the best fucking meat ever. Do you have more of this? And Dad's like, no, I don't have more of this. But he eventually starts force feeding his daughter olive oil or salad oil in her sleep. And she's like, what the fuck are you doing? So she gets away and the dad starts chugging oil himself and cuts off his own limbs to fry up and feed. And rather than blood coming out of his body, it's oil. This story for me was like really disturbing because of how it played with the body horror. And also it was a story that I think managed to capture its essence of living in a grease pit and living somewhere that's so completely saturated with oil. Like, as I was reading this, I could genuinely feel that. And it was like, ew. But I would give this one like 4.5 stars. I enjoyed this one. I thought it was creepy and went off the rails. Then we have our final little bonus story. It's super short. It's just fashion model. We know her. We've seen her. This is The Cursed Frame. And we're following a girl who was just cast into a modeling agency, and she has this thing where she doesn't like to be photographed in pieces. So like she would never want to have like what I'm doing now, where it's only like from here up. It always has to be her and her full body in the picture because it just gives her a phobia. It makes her feel like she's being cut up into pieces. And she runs into one of the models and she's like, I don't know why this woman works here and why she would be a model. So the woman overhears, and as we know, Miss Fashion Model loves to do, because she's not exactly human, pull out her shark teeth and violently severs this person. And the only question I was left with at the end here is, did she die from blood loss? I'm assuming she died from blood loss because all of her vital organs here are like still intact. I enjoyed this relatively. I thought it was short, a little bit too short, but that's fine because it literally was supposed to be a bonus, like little snippet of Fashion Model. I find Fashion Model creepy, but much like with The Long Dream, I would have wanted to see more of the creepiness and the gore beyond our super scary character here. Like, look at those teeth. But anyway, that is the end of Shiver, and I gave Fashion Model Cursed Frame a total rating of 3 stars. My final feelings on Shiver and how I would rate this, I would rate this as a 4-star book because it definitely lingered with me and was the kind of book that felt haunting. I was mostly afraid at night, like it infiltrated my nightmares, and I thought that was very well done. But as you can see on the screen, here is my feelings of how I would rate this book, just going on gut instinct versus what the actual rating is based on my rating of each individual story. Let us move on to the next book. am halfway through the Liminal Zone. There's only 4 stories in here. I don't know why, but I didn't think this was a short story collection, but it is. So just like with Tombs, I'm gonna tell you my thoughts on the first 2 stories, and I'll tell you my thoughts on the last 2 stories. So the first story in the Liminal Zone is Weeping Woman Way. And in this story, we are following a couple, a woman and her fiance, and they're visiting this town for like a little vacation, and they walk past this funeral. And in this funeral is this woman who's just like screaming and sobbing and crying so much that they could hear from across town. So they look inside and they're like, wow, whoever this woman is must be really devastated. Like, my gosh, she is so heartbroken. Whoever died must have been so important to her. And this stranger comes up to them and it's like, oh, you're not from around here. This is a weeping woman. They're pretty much out of fashion now, so I'm surprised that this family has hired a weeping woman. But a weeping woman is someone that you would hire in the past. You would hire someone to come to a funeral to kind of put the dead at peace. It was considered the ultimate form of respect for the person who has passed away, but it's gone out of fashion. They don't think anything of it, so they really just go on their walk and they run into the weeping woman who left the funeral, and she gives them this crazy side eye. Like, let me show you. Like, my girl really just glares them down, and that starts the story where our main female character starts weeping, like uncontrollably. She is constantly sobbing, can't stop crying, everything's making her sad. She goes to the doctor, they give her antidepressants, but it's not helping. Like, literally, this woman cannot stop crying. They run into a fortune teller and they go to this town where they end up running into Weeping Woman Way, a town nobody's heard of, where just a bunch of women cry as a way to kind of pay respect to the dead and to release any spirits who are not at peace. They think that our main female character is the reincarnation of their original, like, weeping woman, and they need her to come to help put these spirits at ease, to help put them at peace because they haven't been able to. And there's this swamp, literally a river, that the woman cried that's drying up, and they need her assistance, and she feels very called to the cause, so she does it. Ultimately, my girl dies of crying, dehydration, just literally dies, and she gets reincarnated as the weeping woman. There were some scenes in here that were overall creepy, like this one specifically with, that's a corpse, crying because she is the original weeping woman. And some of these scenes are like horrific. Like, look at this. She's literally exploding. Ew. I enjoyed this story overall. Just like with Tombs, I thought that this was really, really creative, and I'm continuously impressed by Junji Ito's creative abilities, his just like ability to think of these stories. You're like, who thought of that? But also just his art style, and that is really great. And then just like very creepy moments, also disturbing. And while I thought this story was disturbing, I wasn't particularly scared, but I did overall enjoy it, although I struggled to remember that this was the first story in the book. So for that reason, I'm gonna give it 3 stars. I don't think I'll remember this story. In fact, I forgot it from one day to the next, but I still think that it was really creative and fun to read about, in the way that like reading horror and thriller is fun. Not that the concept itself is fun, but the reading experience was fun. Was this story Madonna? And I'm gonna put that with a grain of salt. Not fun in the sense that this topic was genuinely really disturbing, and you can see the Madonna from the story on the back. I apologize, it's very shiny because it's a library book, so it has a protective cover on it. So the Madonna follows this student who transferred into Tensei University, or Tensei boarding school, a religious like missionary school is how she describes it. She transfers in, and shit's weird, okay? There is the principal who quite honestly is a fucking pedophile, like legitimately. He gathers all of the students who he perceives to be the most beautiful, and he puts them into a special class, and his mission is to find the reincarnation of the Virgin Mary, the Madonna. He is a pedophile and very much attempts to get with our underage, she's literally like maybe 13 years old, child, and insists that she's the reincarnation of the Virgin Mary, and it's her job to carry the sacred child. His sacred child. And his wife is the head mistress of this university, and apparently she was kind and beautiful, but now she's just like a raging bitch. Apparently they call her like the evil woman, or like the angry witch woman, because she is so horrifically cruel to everyone on the campus, is super strict. For example, 2 girls are just like whispering and chattering, and she forces them to kneel at the cross for 2 hours. She finds out that her husband is cheating, which, you know what? You know how she got with her husband? By helping him cheat on his wife. So that is what it is. And instead of being angry that her husband is a raging fucking pedophile and genuinely a creep, she's upset that he doesn't think that she is the Virgin Mary. And so she goes on a rampage, and she has this mysterious power where she can turn everyone into pillars of salt. This guy, the sun. Yeah. Pillars of salt. She goes on a crazy ass rampage. She is chasing everyone down. There's this whole thing where they killed the principal's ex-wife, the woman that she, you know, forsaken for. You can see some very creepy scenes here. And I would say this story was overall disturbing because it had a strong kind of cult feeling to it. A lot of brainwashing, lots of warnings for pedophilia. Our main character definitely is like, fuck no, you're a fucking creep. It was really interesting the way that all the characters die by being turned into salt. I genuinely was disturbed and unsettled while reading this. I realized I've been looking down for most of the clips because I've just been looking at the images to refresh my memory of the story. While I genuinely was disturbed, I think that I enjoyed this story the most for this collection thus far, and I would give this like a solid 4.5. It's definitely not comedic in the way that some other ones have been. The concepts definitely do get weird because this woman has the ability to turn people into pillars of salt, but it was still a really fun time, and you all know I love a weird ending, so that is a 4-star reading for story number 2. As always, I'm going to go and read the final 2 stories in this collection, and then I will give you my update, which means we're almost ready to move on to the final book in this vlog, Uzumaki, which many people will argue is Junji Ito's masterpiece. It's not all sentient hairballs and slugs. Junji Ito is genuinely tackling some pretty serious topics throughout this book. The very next story that I read was Spirit Flow of Aikogara. I'm very sure that I butchered that. But in the spirit flow of Aikogara, we are following a young man who has been diagnosed with a terminal illness that will ultimately lead to his death. And he has decided that he would rather take his own life than to go through the process of trying to seek treatment to an illness which has no cure. So he goes into the forest to end his own life, and he brings his girlfriend with him. His girlfriend decides that she is going to go with him to accompany him, and I thought that just meant they were going to go into the forest together, but no, she also plans to take her life when he takes his. So lots of serious topics and conversations being tackled in this, so please be mindful of the content warnings. But they go into the forest and they encounter this cave, and they realize that this cave that they have encountered is the legendary spirit flow, where spirits kind of flow out of the cave and either find their eternal rest or are looped into some kind of like cave system. Nobody knows, but our main character in his final stages of his life has decided that he's just going to stay in the forest. He wants to see the spirit flow. That is his dying request. So they do end up seeing the spirit flow, and he's like, you know what? If I just jump into it, the spirits will carry me to the other side. So he jumps into this spirit flow, and he gets scared, and he decides to hold on to a tree while the spirits rush past him so that he is able to decide that he didn't want to go to the other side. So our main female character finds him after the spirit flow flows over and he's clinging to a tree. And he's like, you know what, Mika, it's super weird because I actually feel so much stronger and healthier. I think that the spirit flow has some healing properties, and I decided that I don't want to die anymore. I think that the spirit flow can help me. So he stays there for several days, just kind of jumping into the spirit flow, getting himself some healing properties. And he tells his girlfriend, we don't have enough supplies to stay in the woods. You go home, you get some supplies, and I'll be back next week. But he's gone for 2 weeks. So she goes back into the forest to find him, and she realizes that he looks very different. Like, this is what he looks like at the beginning of the story. And when she finds him, he looks like that. And she's like, I don't think you should stay here in this spirit flow. And it essentially becomes the story of the consequences of him jumping into the spirit flow. And the forest that they're in is actually a forest where people have gone in to take their own lives. So he sees another man who's about to take his own life, and he's like, no, don't do it. Come into the spirit flow with me. It has these amazing healing properties. And they get healed, and slowly each time they jump into the flow, their bodies change. Like, they become longer and skinnier and like more stretched out, and they're saying like more refined, very much losing their grip on reality because the spirits, when they're flowing, lick them. Now, I thought that was like a metaphor for like the ectoplasm. No, they actually lick them. A tongue. They get licked by the spirits as the spirits are flowing through the forest. And we get to our conclusion where our main female character jumps in because she very obviously is losing her boyfriend. Lots of homoerotic undertones here, which I thought was very interesting for this story. But she gets sucked into the spirit flow. She lets go, and they find her in the cave underwater with all of these things that, lo and behold, are not spirits, but people who have jumped into the spirit flow. And rather than being at peace and dying, each time they go to the flow, they just get more and more stretched out until they're parts of the spirit flow, eternally trapped in this loop where they're continuously caught in the ecstasy of being flown out of the cave and looped right back in underground. This was a very interesting story, and while I definitely appreciate some of the conversations that are being had here, especially around suicide for people who are terminally ill, that's definitely one of the main conversations throughout this. I also really appreciated the art style and just like how genuinely interesting this story was, like this whole concept of a spirit flow. But I would say of all of the stories, this is probably on par with Weeping Woman Way. Lots of these stories center around like religious themes and spirits, souls. So that's an interesting theme for this story. I would say it's on par. So I would also rank this at like a 3.5 star. And our final story is Slumber. Slumber is the story of this young man who is in law school. He is super stressed out. He's failed the bar 3 times. And every night he has dreams that he is killing someone. Like, he has dreams of stabbing them and wrapping them up in a parka and escaping, and he is feeling tremendous guilt because he doesn't understand why it is that he's waking up in the middle of the night and killing people. And he's like, but I don't own a parka. And then he looks in his closet and he sees a parka and a knife, and he's like, oh my gosh, that's so weird. Like, what is going on? I have to turn myself in. He's plagued by guilt because he's killing all of these people, and he's gonna turn himself in. But his best friend here, it's like, you know what, that really doesn't sound like you. It sounds like something else is going on, and I really want you to just stay at home. I'm gonna go home, I'm gonna get a camera, and we're gonna record you. And if you're still asleep at the time of these killings, you'll know that it is not you. Our main character is going home, and unfortunately she runs into the killer, and she sprays him with pepper spray, which saves her life. She still gets brutally stabbed, but he doesn't hit any vital organs because he's blinded, so she is saved. And they find the real killer, which is this guy, not her main character. And this guy talks about how he has the power to put his memories into what he calls like a confidant. He can put his memories into a confidant. And he has been doing that to our main character because they live in the same apartment building. So our main character is innocent, but he is plagued for the rest of his life by the memories of this serial killer who forces memories into his own mind. And we end the story with him being possessed by the killer, because the killer has taken over his mind and had been doing so for quite a while. At its root, this story is quite tragic and sad. There's definitely a lot of gruesome death in the ways that I haven't seen previously in the other Junji Ito stories that I have been reading, and I definitely enjoyed this, and just like the way Junji Ito is playing with the concept of reality, and like how terrifying is this? It's being framed, but being framed in such like an insidious way. I thought it was fascinating. I decided that I want to give you my overall rating for the story, and I'm gonna pop that on the screen, the overall rating versus the average rating. Did I tell you my ratings for the I didn't tell you my rating for this story. I don't think. I would give this story probably like a 3-star. They're all 3 stars, and my favorite one by far is the one about the school with the Madonna story. I thought that story was really, really creepy. So my overall feelings about this collection is, I would say like a 3.75, but we'll see what my actual rating is now. And so we have reached Uzumaki. This is an interesting one. I wasn't sure how to tackle it because unlike the other books that I've read, this isn't a collection of short stories. It's one overarching story following the same characters and the people that she's encountering in this town who are being affected by the spiral. I'm gonna do a check-in now. I'll do a check-in halfway through, and I'll do a check-in at the end. I'm officially 6 chapters into Uzumaki, and the best thing I can tell you about this book is that we are following a main character who is telling us a story of her town, and her town is full of spirals. And just like some of the other stories, there is a catalyst character. So the catalyst character is our main character's boyfriend. His father starts to become obsessed with spirals. Like, it completely takes over his entire life to the point where he ends up taking his own life by turning himself into a spiral. What do I mean by that? This is what I mean. He literally turned himself into a spiral. Don't know how he manages to do that, but that of course has huge effects and impacts on the family. The mother is traumatized by her husband doing this, and she becomes absolutely like terrified and has a huge phobia of spirals. But what's really interesting about this that I think Junji Ito is doing really well is settling in this creepy factor for something that people usually don't have a fear of, and that is that spirals are everywhere. And our main character's her boyfriend's mom knows this because every night she hears her husband, and he's like, come with us in the spiral whenever she sees a spiral. But there are spirals on your fingertips, in the curls of your hair. There's spiral within your ear. There's spirals within like your intestines. So she's not doing so hot. She absolutely is petrified of spirals, and it ends with her realizing that there is a spiral in her ear and her feeling like her husband has crawled into her ear and is living inside of her ear. So she stabs herself in the ear with a pair of scissors, which leads her to, of course, lose her hearing, but also impacts her sense of balance because your inner ear is where you get like your sense of balance. So she has a constant sense of vertigo and is always dizzy. And this is how she pictures her husband and how she pictures him crawling inside of her. And that is deeply disturbing. Like, the idea of something living inside of your ear is something that I already have a fear of. So I'm like, ew. There's this image of this woman who had a spider in her ear, and like the doctor has a little stethoscope and all you see is like its eyes and it's bleh. So that's what that story is. I'm laughing, not because I think the story is funny, because it definitely wasn't, but because of how terrifying that phobia is. And so far, I think at that point, I was just like building intrigue. I was like, okay, I am appreciating the chance to get invested into the characters because this is one overarching story and we're following the main 2 people throughout a huge portion of it. We're getting to know a lot about them and also getting to see these key moments in their lives. And I imagine the boyfriend, the one whose parents have been most affected by these spirals, is going to eventually succumb to it. And you can see like little hints of him trying to retain his like sanity and grip on what is going on, but he is seeing the spirals and he's recognizing that it is affecting people in more ways than what they recognize and realize. I'm enjoying that aspect of it a lot, and I am just appreciating the chance to be with the characters. The next story that we read, which I think has some of the best imagery I've read so far in the book, is this woman who, like this girl in high school, who has this scar that like seduces and entices men. I don't know. I think it's a placebo. She believes that. She's putting out that energy, and so men are gravitating to her energy. But unfortunately, when she moves to this town, it turns into a spiral. And do you see that image of like her eye just starts swirling within that, and she's like, oh, something's wrong with my eye, but she doesn't feel that she has this giant hole. And it ends in this way where the spiral takes over her entire face, which I think is such a creative and cool concept, and also just like disturbing in a funny way. I've mentioned this so many times, but Junji Ito has this way of taking things that are scary and like putting this light comedic, like ridiculous twist on it. Surrealism is what I want to call it, but I don't think that's right, but it's very amusing. And she ends up sucking this guy into her face who like was obsessed with her and had a crush on her, and eventually she becomes consumed by the spiral herself. Like her entire body just turns into a spiral. And that was such an interesting scene, this idea that she was reduced to nothing via her body kind of consuming itself. Really interesting imagery, such a fascinating story, and I really enjoyed that chapter. It just was deeply amusing. What happened in chapter 5? Don't fucking know. Oh, her dad is taking the clay from this river. So whenever somebody dies, they like burn the body. So they cremate it, and those ashes turn into a spiral in the sky. And like no one knows why, but they think it's a bad omen. And our main character's father is like an artist, and he is taking clay from the river and making art from it. And he too is slowly becoming obsessed with the spiral and what this art creates. However, we have this little sinister note going on, which really changed my perspective of her father, because thus far he's just been like this super chill, creative guy, very happy-go-lucky. But in his like kiln where he fires all of the pottery that he's making to like finalize it, the clay that he's using has the spirits of the people who died trapped in it. And you can hear the screams and cries for help. All of the spirits are trapped in there. And the reason that changes my perspective of the father is that's a very like vicious thing to do, for you to hear the screams and cries of the dying and continue to burn that pottery. I mean, obviously you could just disregard it and say like it's not true, but some things about this story leads me to believe that people genuinely do believe that the spirits were trapped in here, which would indicate that the father of our main female character was very aware of what it was that he was doing. And that makes me change my perspective on him, because like, you're burning spirits every single night for the sake of the art. But again, I think it's a huge indication for the fact that the spirals are going to come for him too. Chapter 5 thus far has been the weakest chapter in my mind in this story collection, because it's essentially Romeo and Juliet. And I was like, what does it have to do with anything? What does this have to do with anything? We have these two like teenagers who are like madly in love, but their parents hate each other. They kind of live in what they call tenements, so like government housing, because they're very poor. Their families think that each other is trash, and they want to be together. But each time they try to get together, her boyfriend, so we have her and we have our Romeo character, gets beat up by her family, and they keep trying to run away, and the family is stopping it. And our main female character, her boyfriend, so these two, he says it's because there's a spiral over their house, and the spiral is twisting the spirits and their souls, and that's why they're so angry and they hate each other. But long story short, these two try to run away and they get caught, so they decide that they're going to twist themselves into snakes, lock themselves together, and jump into the sea to live happily ever after as a giant serpent. I want to know where these people are getting this flexibility from. How do you even have the ability and capacity to wind yourself like a snake? Not even. Like a Laffy Taffy. If I took a Laffy Taffy and I stretched it out and I rolled it, that's what they're doing to their bodies. I don't think this was supposed to scare me. It really didn't do anything for me. It felt like, what does this have to do with anything? I'm excited to get back to the story and see the progression of these spirals on this small town. Okay, I'm halfway through Uzumaki, and I have to tell you at this point, I'm so surprised and shocked that this is my least favorite that I've read so far. I think that in the previous books that I've been reading by Junji Ito, the ones I've been reading in this video, he's balancing humor and horror really well. And here he is still doing that via the art style, but the stories themselves are a little bit too ridiculous for me. And I want to know more about this spiral. So far, we're just getting snippets of how this town is being affected, but the suspension of disbelief has been broken for me because some things are happening that are so fucking ridiculous that I just don't understand. I know that one of the stories is a story called Jack in the Box, and in Jack in the Box, the student that our main character goes to school with, I love the color scenes here. This is the only few pages where we get color. He's obsessed with our main female character, and he is chasing her down and just going about his crush on her in a very weird way, pretty much stalking her. But you can tell it's because he doesn't know any better. So he's like, oh, I saw this in a movie. I'll jump in front of a car and my love will stop the car for you. Note, warnings, graphic death here, graphic death. So the car does not stop. His love does not stop the car, and he's been buried because people in this town have stopped cremating people because they have been getting spirals when they cremate the bodies, and they want to avoid that. And Jack in the Box is essentially the story of this child who was hit by this car, and he becomes a zombie, and they're like, oh my gosh, his spine is a spiral. But it's not. It's a car spring, and his body apparently is so decomposed that he's falling apart. But he had only died a few days ago. Decomposition doesn't work that fast, my God. So he's springing around because the spring in his body from the car accident is making him bounce. What does that do with spirals? I don't fucking know. I don't know. And then there's this scene earlier where our main character has long hair and it's curling. It's called Medusa, but the hair becomes sentient and it's absorbing her body and being used to mesmerize people. But I do really like that she has this rival who is desperate for attention, and they start fighting. And this rival, to start with, they're friends, and she looks a lot like this. You can tell, a very pretty girl. But by the end, she is consumed by the spirals. She gets spiral hair like our main character here. And the spirals sap all of her energy and kill her. But I was saying, I like the art style for how you show the progression, not only in what the spiral is doing to her and how it's absorbing her energy, but also how her jealousy is consuming her entire personality. Because by the end of the story, she looks like this. A very interesting story. I don't mind that one as much, but the story that I have some questions about. We have our main character here who only comes to school when it rains, and he comes to school and he's bullied, and essentially he turns into a giant fucking slug monster. Literally turns into a slug. I found this particular scene here really disturbing because you can see his eyeballs become like this, and just the way they poke out is body horror. It makes me want to vomit. But he turns into a giant slug, and instead of being freaked out and calling the police, they call his parents, and they're like, your son is a giant fucking slug crawling on the building. And they're like, that's not my son, the fuck is wrong with you? So they keep him as a pet. The school does. And this is where my suspension of disbelief is broken, because the character's reactions don't make any sense. This little boy just turned into a slug. Your reactions to call the parents and say, come pick up your slug son. I would be calling the police. I would be calling the FBI. I would be calling the hospital, both for this slug child and for myself, because I now need to be hospitalized from seeing that. But he has this bully who's mean to him, and his bully becomes a slug as well. And apparently slugs can mate with anyone. So, a love story? with the two slugs where they go and lay eggs, which is quite nasty, honestly. Again, Junji Ito playing with that fear of like the small clustered holes. In a lot of places, again, look away if that's a phobia, but like this, vile. And the teacher stomps on them and says, this is unnatural. We can't let those two slug monsters breed. And I was like, hard agree, buddy, hard agree. They used to be humans and now they're slug people. But then he turns to this. Vile. The story that I found the most interesting was the Black Lighthouse, which, long story short, the lighthouse is emanating light when it shouldn't be because it's broken. It's hypnotizing people. People are like spinning in circles and they're so dizzy and they like are just trapped in a loop. Turns out the lighthouse is consumed by this spiral, had melted due to the intensity of the heat. Because it was a certain kind of light bulb, when it melted, it produced a giant spiral, and that's the light that's being emanated to people. But it's so freaking hot that it like flash kills people, and our main character ends up getting burned in this light because she's saving her little brother who went to the lighthouse even though he shouldn't have. Little brother is fine, but little brother's friends all weren't that lucky. So our main female character gets hospitalized. And this is now where the story completely falls apart for me. Mosquitoes. What's the premise of mosquitoes? Mosquitoes is pregnant women who need to feed on blood in order to nourish their babies. So they kill people and drink their blood, and the hospital's like, I don't see anything, buddy. But of course they fucking do. They're in on it. And I just need to know, please tell me what's happening. Like, this is a creative idea, but I don't understand why the hospital is like tolerating this kind of behavior, what they have to gain from it. The fact that that's not normal. And like, yeah, sure, these babies are like cute and whatever, but the babies can also talk. They regrow their umbilical cords and the placentas. And this scene I did find really disturbing. Just as a woman, it like gave me an ick because the doctor absolutely loses his fucking mind. He's been in on it the whole time. I don't know why he's been in on it the whole time, but he has been in on it the whole time. And he is forcing the babies, I'm gonna just cover this, nudity warning. He's surgically embedding the babies back in the mothers. And as a woman, I find that absolutely vile. Absolutely vile. So as soon as babies are back in, the women turn into mosquitoes, essentially, and kill people. Again, it leaves me with the question of what is going on with this town that they're not like, you know what? Something's wrong. Something is wrong. And I think we should, in fact, call the CIA. I think that we are being invaded by aliens. In fact, I think that we all need Jesus in our life. That's it. That's what's happening so far. And the main question I have is, why is no one reacting the way that they should be reacting? And that has broken the suspension of disbelief, which of course was not that strong to begin with, right? Like, I know it's a horror story, familiar now with like Junji Ito's style, but this just feels different in the way that I'm like, I think there's supposed to be an overarching story, but I'm not seeing it because I don't understand what the spirals have to do with anything. Am I going to learn more about the spirals? Am I going to understand why the spirals are relevant? And what do these stories have to do with the spirals? I need more connection between them. Then we'll do one more update, which will be the final update for Uzumaki. I mean, is he wrong though? She came out into a hurricane to bring him lunch. I may have a rival. This is what I just wanted to show you. This made me laugh so much. But also you can see Shuichi's like expression changing and like how exhausted he is and how consumed he is by that spiral. But the idea that he's like, the hurricane fancies you, rival, just made me laugh. decided to do this. Anyway, besties, I am officially 3/4 of the way through Uzumaki, and I am enjoying it a lot more. I feel like the first section was like groundwork, and then we have a few stories here. Filler stories? Not really, like they all circle back, and I'm not going to give you a recap of what's happening. Just know that we're now living in a post-apocalyptic situation. This town is completely isolated and trapped in the spiral because anyone who tries to get in is able to get in, but they can't leave. What I find disturbing is just like how awful these people become. Like, yeah, it's apocalyptic, but part of the horror of this story and where it's going is that people are in general being different and outright cruel towards each other, and I find that so interesting. Remember the snail people that I mentioned earlier, the ones that kind of turn into giant snails? Yeah, everyone is turning into a giant snail unless you're living in one of the like row houses that we saw in the Romeo and Juliet like story. But those row houses are so full that people are twisted together and locked together. And what do I mean by that? I quite literally mean that people are twisted together and locked together. The houses got so full. So your option is to become a giant snake person wrapped up with thousands of other people, or to become a snail. Those are your options. And honestly, people are struggling. What I was saying about the snail people is that the snail people are being cooked and eaten by others, and I find that so disturbing and disgusting. And it was also like such a creative way for Junji Ito to bring in horror, because there was these elements of like morality and that they were people, but now they're giant snails. So is it still cannibalism if you eat them? And I'm like, yeah, probably still cannibalism. Like, hello besties, let me show you what this looks like. That's the cooked snail people, and as you can see, that's a face. So yeah, you still are eating people. You're still eating people. Go ahead and finish Uzumaki, and we'll see how it ends, because we just got to the point, again, this is a spoiler-filled vlog, where Kiri's little brother is turning into a snail. Yeah. Okay, see you when it's done. Uzumaki is a love story, and this is my dissertation on why Uzumaki is actually a romance novel. I am 100% kidding, although I do think there are very strong romantic elements through here. We're following a main male and female character and like their relationship throughout the apocalypse, and it ends with their love story of sorts. Tragedy, but they're together forever. I'm gonna give Uzumaki overall like a 3.75. And I realized by the end of this that this was actually printed as like individual mangas and then eventually compiled into one collection here. The idea of a spiral haunting a town is bizarre, but by the end it does get creepy. And I'm gonna have to give points for how much creepy imagery there is in this book. And I love the like random pages that we get that are in full color. By the end, I appreciated and loved the apocalypse story more. I would say I liked the beginning. I loved the end. I loved where the story went, but there were some stories in there I was like, what does that have to do with anything? For example, Jack in the Box, the umbilical cord, and mosquitoes. Those never come back up again and have no relevance to the story at all. So it's like, what? But either way, I'm gonna keep this brief, I'm gonna keep this short. I didn't spoil too much about Uzumaki, although I did tell you this was a spoiler-filled vlog. And there you have it. These are the 4 Junji Ito books I read for this video. I'm gonna rank them for you, but I'm gonna tell you they're all pretty much tied. Like, I enjoyed them equal parts, and I gave almost all of them 3.75 to 4 stars in my mind, but of course you have my average rating for the short story collection. So besties, that brings us to the end of this video. As always, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you being here. There are a few Junji Ito books I would love to check out again, because by the end of this video I realized I really like Junji Ito's horror style. Things that if you think about them too much are humorous, but Junji Ito somehow is incorporating fear and horror into there. I really enjoy. I would love to check out Tomi, but if there are some other Junji Ito novels that you think I would enjoy based on this video, leave them in the comments below. If you aren't already, please do subscribe, and I'm gonna see you in my next video. Bye.